From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Joe Matthew.
A textbook case of mismanagement. That's how one top regulator testifying before lawmakers described the recent bank failures. The regulators say your money is safe.
To ensure that Americans' deposits are safe.
We are committed to ensuring that all deposits are safe.
Depositors will continue to have access to their savings.
Meantime, lawmakers rail against the absence of the bank's leaders.
We could move more quickly if the bank CEOs got out of their ivory towers and actually came and talked to us.
We'll get reaction and analysis from our panel and from Heather Boushey of the White House Council of Economic Advisors.
And today marks 1 week since former President Donald Trump predicted he'd be arrested. And so far, the investigation continues with the grand jury not meeting for the rest of this week. And there's more potential trouble for the former president as a federal judge orders Mike Pence to testify before a different grand jury investigating Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. We'll talk with attorney Lanny Davis, who's representing Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen.
Around the table with us today, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and banking regulation reporter Katanga Johnson, following a day of hearings on Capitol Hill, specifically in the Senate. Anne-Marie, I don't know if you made it through this entire exercise, but that was only day one. We're going to do this again in the House tomorrow.
It's the start of the autopsy that all of these lawmakers have been coming on our program and telling us we can't do anything yet with regulation, FDIC, caps, until we know what went wrong.
Exactly.
One thing was clear. No one trusts the management at these banks.
That's true. I'm wondering if anyone trusts the regulators by the time this was done, but we're going to be looking for a report on the 1st of May. That's one thing we learned today. That's the Fed's investigation. Michael Barr's report the 1st of May. And Megan, I'll start with you because you were steeped in this all day long. Megan and Katanga were watching, so you don't have to. Now, most lawmakers seem to show up with their minds made up before they even started asking questions. That's not unusual for a hearing. But one thing that was interesting to see Democrats and Republicans really agree on was that this was a failure of regulators to do their jobs.
Absolutely. It's a rare day on Capitol Hill when there's a common enemy. And the bank management certainly fit that mold today. You did see some differences, though, amongst the parties. Lawmakers kind of fell into three buckets here. You had Republicans who said, this was a bank management fault, and who really went after regulators and said, you had more power to investigate here. You had more power to act, and you didn't. Then you have sort of the moderate middle of the ground, the John Testers of the world, the Democrats who voted in 2018 to roll back some banking regulations, who, tried to play the middle and say, if it was the regulators that were the problem here, we need to go after that. If it was the regulations, then we need to go after that. And then you have the Elizabeth Warrens. She asked essentially for all of the regulators to take a vow that they would regulate harder going forward here.
I'm glad you brought that up. We have that interaction, and I think this speaks volumes to the tension that's growing right now in Congress. Take a listen.
I'm not going to talk about specific names, but we need someone who has a proven history of willingness to regulate and be tough with these big financial institutions. We don't need somebody else who's just going to roll over for them.
So clearly Elizabeth Warren wants more regulation. How even likely is that in this divided Congress?
So just about anything is difficult to get through, especially with Republicans in charge of the House and Democrats in charge of the Senate. And you've seen that on the efforts regarding FDIC and whether or not to increase that limit, whether to enshrine it in law. I think for the time being, particularly after today, when regulators said, we're going to push harder in terms of oversight of these banks and use our full authorities. I think you're going to see sort of an impetus on the Hill to just hold up for a second. Not amongst the Elizabeth Warrens, of course, but amongst sort of the moderates and certainly the Republicans.
So let's run with that for a minute, Katanga, because it's unclear if Congress is going to be able to move here. I wonder, though, if these hearings will make it more likely that there's a product, as they like to call it, that addresses financial regulations, but also what can the administration do here? Because we're hearing the Fed, the Treasury considering a lot of steps. Regulators can take some actions on their own without lawmakers.
That's right. Regulators do have authority, even now with existing rules, to take a really hard look at not just the role that they may have played in oversight here or lack of oversight, but also really focusing on whether there might be a need for changes in how they interpret certain mandates around capital requirements, liquidity requirements, as well as even stress testing, which came up. Both the FDIC and the Fed both agreed today that in this May 1 report that both agencies will separately produce, that they're going to also take a look at the ways in which management may have played a role in how they, for banks of a particular size, over $100 billion, might need stiffer rules and more scrutiny from both agencies.
Right, and that's going to be very much so a welcomed response to probably the White House as well as a lot of these Democratic lawmakers. But the Fed is also potentially welcoming maybe even outsiders looking into what went on?
Yeah, the Fed did say today that it's willing to, in addition to its own investigation, even have an outside counsel, whether that's appointed by the White House or by Congress, to look into these issues. We saw from Michael Barr, the Fed's vice supervision, him really saying that he wanted to address lawmakers' concerns, make it clear that the onus was on him and the Fed to look at their own handling of this, but really they're open to scrutiny.
This was day one, as we mentioned. This was the Senate. This was the upper chamber. Tomorrow is going to be in the House. I spoke with one of the members on financial services earlier today, Congressman Timmons from South Carolina. He invoked woke bank. He invoked any number of issues that we've heard, social agendas that he believes led to the banking failure. Is tomorrow going to be a free-for-all compared to today?
I think so. In the House, you often have, we didn't hear much about woke banking today, right. But we will hear about it tomorrow. Maybe not necessarily from the chairman, Patrick McHenry, but perhaps from some of the newer members of the committee. Yes. That's
just, I guess, part of the conversation now. Although, Anne-Marie, it's been a couple of weeks since we've heard Republicans really hammering that home. Tomorrow, right. I guess it comes back to life.
They have been calling these banks, quote unquote, woke banks, but you're right. There's a lot of Republicans who are saying actually the underlying issue is the fact that these banks didn't hedge against short-term paper, right. And they are actually blaming the aggressive interest rate hikes, which who do they blame that on? Inflation.
That's correct, although it comes back down to transitory for some of them as well.
Right.
There's a good way to turn the screws on that.
But they're saying this is a Biden-induced inflation.
It all comes back to Joe Biden. That's exactly right.
100%.
Great conversation, as always. Many thanks to Bloomberg's Megan Scully and banking and regulation reporter Katanga Johnson with us to get things started on Balance of Power. Coming up, we're going to talk to the lawyer representing Michael Cohen. Former President Trump's ex-fixer, Lanny Davis, will be with us after the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Donald Trump's legal tensions in New York continue as the grand jury in the Stormy Daniels hush money case reportedly will not hear any more Trump-related matters this week. So now we're on to next, it seems, remembering that Trump himself said he would be arrested a week ago today. Well, that has not happened. And there's more. Another layer today as a federal judge separately orders former Vice President Mike Pence to testify to a January 6th grand jury. But as we wait for word on the case in New York, we're joined now by Lanny Davis, partner and co-founder of David Goldberg and Galper, and attorney for Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. Lanny, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us today. Is this case going to lead to an indictment?
So I really do not know the answer to that. I've spent a lot of time with Mr. Cohen, my client, with the prosecutors in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and all I can tell you is that they have been meticulous in surrounding everything that my client says with documents, with telephone calls, with messages, with other people corroborating. Michael Cohen, I think, has proven himself to be credible since he announced to the world on national and international television in the Cummings hearings in 2018-19 that he wanted to tell the truth, and he was ashamed of what he had done for Trump. Now it really comes down to whether there is a case that a jury can hear, and it's up to the jury to decide what the truth is, not political commentators like me.
Lanny, for those who do not know, you have a long history dealing with presidents and the law, going back to the Clinton administration, of course. How do you answer critics who call this a zombie case, who say it doesn't rise to the level of indicting a former president, doesn't have the strength to lead to an indictment?
So I always say, don't believe me, just believe the federal prosecutors who worked for Donald Trump and what they said publicly. They said that Donald Trump directed Michael Cohen to pay hush money to influence an election. That's a crime. They said, it's not about sex, it's a crime. They said it's a crime that undermines our democracy because it withholds information from the American people before an election for the advantage of a secret hush money payment. They said that Donald Trump, while he was president of the United States, sitting president, wrote $35,000 checks from his checking account to reimburse Michael Cohen for paying the hush money that Michael Cohen went to jail for. So I simply answer, if Michael Cohen did this serious crime that impaired our democracy, he didn't have the affair, the hush money didn't benefit him, and the federal prosecutors who worked in the Trump administration during Donald Trump's presidency said Trump directed Michael Cohen to do the crime. How's it possible that, therefore, it's not a serious crime enough for an ex-president to be prosecuted? I think the rule of law says no person is above the law.
Lanny, NBC this weekend interviewed Donald Trump's attorney, asking him directly about the source of those funds in the Stormy Daniels hush money case. I want you to take a listen to this.
It's personal funds. It was not funds related to the campaign. That's the distinction.
But he used a Trump Organization check.
Not campaign finance laws. But Chuck, that's personal. That's personal. It has nothing to do.
So everything with the Trump Organization is Donald Trump's person? I mean, you realize the door you're opening there.
Chuck, you're absolutely conflating issues.
Lanny, did Trump's lawyer actually get him into potentially more trouble? Did he just open up another window?
Yeah, that's criminal if Joe is right. I know Joe Tacopina is a great lawyer. We work together. And so I'm sorry that he has such a tough position to defend, but that's what lawyers do. Look, here's the only fact that matters. What will a jury think when Donald Trump says that his directing, which is what federal prosecutors have charged him with, directing Michael Cohen to do the crime, to influence an election, that's a crime, and he went to jail for that crime. What will a jury think if somebody, I don't know if it will be Donald Trump testifying because he's taken the fifth so far, but somebody will say what Joe Tacopina just said. He only did it for personal reasons. It had nothing to do with the campaign and the election right after Access Hollywood, after another affair, allegedly, with Karen McDougal, a Playboy playmate. Now comes out Stormy Daniels, an adult film star. What would a jury think? That this had nothing to do with the campaign just 2 weeks before the election. It was about worrying about Melania. Will they believe that? And this is a jury system. I believe that Donald Trump is innocent until proven guilty. That is our system. So now we have to ask, will the jury believe what Joe Tacopina just said? It was only personal. Yeah. And I'll say to Mr. Tacopina, we'll leave it to a jury.
Lanny, Donald Trump says the legal actions that he's facing, including your case, are a new form of election interference, that Democrats like you are pursuing this because you can't beat him at the ballot box. How do you react?
Well, look, anyone accused of a crime who's running for office will say they're attacking me in order to defeat me or political reasons. My answer is, Mr. Trump, this is a system of justice. If you're right, you'll be acquitted by a jury. What you're fearful of is that a jury won't believe you. And of course, Mr. Trump having a record of exactly not knowing the difference between truth and lies, it's up to a jury to decide. But I give him due process rights. He's presumed innocent. And Mr. Trump should trust, which he doesn't, and a system of justice that doesn't make a difference between an ex-president and Michael Cohen. They should be treated the same, and that is our system of justice, Joe.
Lanny, this is one of 4 investigations to the former president. We got some news on one of them about overturning the election results today because now Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence, is going to get a subpoena. He's going to have to go to this grand jury as well. What is the probability of all these cases coming to a head at once for the former president?
Look, I have no idea, and I don't take any joy in the prosecution of Mr. Trump. I think he should be held accountable if he commits wrongdoing. He was allowed to have Michael Cohen, the person he directed to make the money, go to jail, while he didn't because he was an incumbent president. I sometimes wonder whether the insurrection and the denial of the election results, despite all the judges across the country saying that Joe Biden was fairly elected president, I often wonder whether his desperation in not conceding, for the first time in American history, conceding defeat, I wonder whether the desperation was wanting to retain the presidency to protect himself from the wrongdoing that he's now being investigated for. But he's still innocent until he gets into a trial, and if he's innocent, a jury should be able to believe him.
Lanny, thank you so much for your time. That's Lanny Davis, partner and co-founder of Davis, Goldberg, and Galper. And of course, Joe, he's famous because he's the lawyer for Michael Cohen, but he's in California. So what does that tell you?
Maybe no indictment tonight. And it was reported that we're probably on to next week.
Yeah, exactly. So another week potentially.
To your point, though, more likely they all coincide as they resolve these.
And you can almost see that with Trump's rhetoric. He's digging his heels in. All right, coming up, we head to the White House for reaction to the bank hearing today and Speaker McCarthy's letter on the debt ceiling. That's coming up next right here on Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Now the debt ceiling debate in focus on Capitol Hill. We're joined from the White House by Heather Boushey. She's of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Heather, thank you so much for your time. Really, there was a bit of a war of words today from Capitol Hill and the White House regarding the debt ceiling. Here's what the Speaker of the House had to say. He says he's incredibly concerned that the president is putting an already fragile economy in jeopardy. This is by insisting on the position he calls extreme with the debt limit. He said it's time to drop partisanship, roll up our sleeves, and find common ground. And he also wants the White House to get back to him on when they can meet next. Will Speaker McCarthy and President Biden be having another meeting on the debt limit?
Listen, this is such an important economic issue. You know, every day we get up, the economic team that advises the president, and we're looking at the data, the numbers, what's going on in the economy. Nothing could be more important than not adding to the challenges that this economy faces by playing with this debt ceiling. You know, the Speaker himself voted repeatedly to increase the debt ceiling in prior administrations. This is something that has been regularly done by Congress, that has not been taken to the brink. It is so imperative that they get this done, and the president has made clear that he wants to get it done with them. But, of course, the president has put out his budget. He has made his priorities clear. And yet, he has not seen the other side. We've not seen the other side do so at this time. So I think that this is such an important issue, and we do need to make sure that that we don't play with the economy in this way.
How much time do we have to figure this out, Heather? And I ask you that because obviously we're always watching the markets at Bloomberg. And investors seem to be whistling past the graveyard so far on this. There's faith that Washington will somehow figure this out. But we all remember, of course, 2011 and the downgrade from S&P. And I just wonder, how close are we going to get to the line before you start to worry?
Well, quite frankly, I am already worried. I mean, we're already too close. We need to be dealing with this as swiftly as possible in a way that, just like in prior administrations where Republicans came to the table along with Democrats and voted to increase the debt ceiling, separate from other issues. That's what we need to do today. We need to find a way through this as quickly as possible. As you're noting, right now it seems like people are optimistic, perhaps, that we're going to get something done. But we need to see this happen.
I also want to ask Heather about how the Fed chair search is going for the vice chair. Obviously, Lael Brainerd is now a new colleague of yours in the West Wing. Where are we in terms of Fed number 2, especially as we see the Fed on an aggressive interest rate hike and inflation at 6%? Isn't this a key job that needs to be filled immediately?
Well, certainly this is important. It's very exciting to have Lael Brainerd over here at the National Economic Council, of course, but certainly the president is focused on finding a new candidate to serve that role over at the Federal Reserve.
Do you have a timeline for that, Heather? A lot of folks are asking not only the fight against inflation, but also the banking hearings that are underway now, which remind us that the Federal Reserve is investigating these banking failures. I know you weren't part of that hearing today, but it just underscores the urgency, it would seem to me, to get this resolved.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. It is important to get this done. It's also important to recognize that even with someone missing from the Fed, the administration has taken decisive action to make sure that consumers feel that their deposits are safe, and taken all the steps that that the administration could do to help banks through this crisis, regional banks. So the Fed is able to do its job, but certainly the president is focused on finding a new candidate.
Heather, I know you're also playing a really big role in this Invest in America. The president on full display today at Wolf Speed talking about this money going back into the economy from these laws that were passed, whether it was the Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure, CHIPS Act. What is the concern you see as an economist, though, that potentially some of this money is going into already an economy that is overheated with sticky inflation at 6%?
Well, here's the challenge, right? We need to be making these investments to do, as the president says, build an economy from the bottom up and middle out. That was the purpose of so many of these laws, the bucket of laws that he was talking about today, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. These are the Invest in America agenda, along with the American Rescue Plan. And these are making investments all across the country to shore up our nation's infrastructure, to lower costs for families, to make sure that we're investing in clean energy and in manufacturing and really critical industries like semiconductors. And these are, helping to make investments in the here and now, but it's also the longer term investments in the supply side of our economy that is so desperately needed. And of course, we're in this challenging economic moment. We have been coming out of this pandemic recession, and the economy has, had a number of challenges, inflation core among them. But yet we do need to make these investments to make America stronger. And again, as the president likes to say, build the economy from the bottom up and middle out.
Heather Boushey joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. We thank you, Heather, for being with us on Balance of Power. Anne-Marie, it really underscores the story that this president is still trying to tell about what was accomplished in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and the next 3 weeks, he's going to be on the quote-unquote campaign trail, isn't he? They're going to 20 states, him and his cabinet.
Just no announcement yet.
Yeah.
Coming up, we'll talk investment and the UK and turmoil in global banking with UK Treasury Chief Secretary John Glen.
A lot of different places we can make change. I'm going to be introducing bipartisan legislation in the next couple of days that will help with part of it. But understand this, ultimately, big responsibility for this failure rests with Congress, because Congress is the one that changed the law in 2018 that opened the door to the regulators deciding to just not enforce the rules, and that put us all at risk.
That was Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts speaking with Kayleigh Lyons on the sidelines of the Senate Banking Committee's first hearing on the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature. Kayleigh is here with more of the takeaways from the Hill. A similar line, not so surprised what Elizabeth Warren is saying, are we, Kayleigh?
Yeah, no, it's not surprising because so much of this debate has centered around that 2018 rollback of certain Dodd-Frank era requirements. But I really just want to dig into that in particular because, of course, it raised the threshold of the most stringent prudential requirements being applied applied from banks with $50 billion in assets up to $250 billion in assets. But for banks between $100 billion and $250 billion, it did leave some discretion up to the regulators. If you look at the actual text of the act, it says the Board of Governors can apply any prudential standard to any bank with total consolidated assets equal or greater to $100 billion, to which the prudential standard does not otherwise apply, provided that the board determines the application of that standard is appropriate to prevent or mitigate risks to the financial stability of the United States. So in theory, the door was open for regulators to do more with the likes of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature. And this is really the subject of political debate. On the one hand, Republicans say you had the authority, you didn't act on it. This is a supervisory failure. Democrats may agree that supervisors dropped the ball, but they also think that just too lax regulation is to blame. And of course, you had Senator Elizabeth Warren getting all three witnesses today to agree that stronger regulation is needed. We heard from the Fed's vice chair, Michael Barr, the Fed's vice chair of supervision, who says he anticipates the need to strengthen capital and liquidity standards for banks with assets larger than $100 billion. And that is also something referenced in Marty Grunberg's testimony. He said prudential regulation of banks of that size merits additional attention. So this suggests that stronger rules may be proposed this year, and that could impact about 8 banks in the KBW Bank Index that have assets of this size. In theory, this could mean tougher regulation, which could mean it weighs on profits, crimps lending, and raises expenses. All of that could weigh on share prices, which, as we know, already have been under extreme pressure in recent weeks. Regional banks as a whole down about 30% over the last month as this crisis has unfolded, Joe.
Many thanks, Kayleigh. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons bringing us up to date on the hearing today. We'll have another one tomorrow. And for more on the international fallout in the banking sector, let's bring in John Glen, UK Treasurer Chief Secretary. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us here at the table on Balance of Power. This, of course, is not only an American issue. How concerned are you about the stability of the global financial banking sector specifically right now?
Well, I was the UK's banking minister for 4.5 years until last summer. And obviously, I'm very aware we have a very different banking system, but we in the UK are certainly not complacent. We have a very strong regulator in the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which obviously helped us deal with the SVB situation a few weeks ago. But the reality is there are very significant differences. Obviously, the banks are having to adjust to a new environment in terms of interest rates, and that's created some challenges for them. But whilst we're not taking anything for granted, we're pretty confident that we're in we need to be vigilant, but we've got a stable situation in the UK.
But the polls show that Brits are actually quite concerned. More than half are really worried about the global financial system, more than a quarter as well about the UK's own banks. What are you doing to try to shore that up? Are you concerned that you're going to see deposits leave some of these smaller UK banks?
No, I'm not. As I said, the structure is very different. We've got a small number of very large banks, and their capital requirements are very rigorously enforced by our regulators, who obviously had a step change after the financial crisis 15 years ago. So I don't want to be complacent, but I do think that means that we're in good shape. But obviously, we've got to keep aware of all the challenges in different banks and the different profile of concentration of customers, the different liquidity challenges and issues that they all face in different ways.
Interesting. The chair of the Financial Services Committee in the House, who will be leading tomorrow's hearing, called this the first Twitter bank run. How does your system handle the speed with which decisions are being made to withdraw or move money, not to mention the speed with which word can travel over social media to create something of an hysteria?
Well, you absolutely put your finger on the right issue, which is the way that behaviours can move very quickly. And it is particularly true, and we saw that with SVB, when a very, very high concentration of the tech sector used SVB across the globe. That created some distinct challenges. But what we've got to say is that we do have capital requirements. We do have deep oversight of these banks through our regulators in the PRA and FCA. So whilst I wouldn't want to take anything for granted, I think that we can understand different banks and the different challenges they may face through that degree of scrutiny, which has been so reinforced over the last decade since the crisis in 2008.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has, of course, unlocked this wider Brexit agreement.
Yes.
What's happening with the MOU when it comes to the financial sector?
Well, we've been ready to sign that MOU for the last 2 years. I was ready to sign it. I never got to sign it when I was the Financial Services Minister in the UK. I hope that will be possible soon. We want to have a positive trading relationship. I can't say when that will be.
months?
It's not my responsibility directly now.
This year?
Look, I hope it'll be as soon as we reasonably can. It will be down to the EU to decide when they're ready to do that. But I think what the Prime Minister has achieved with the Windsor framework is generally acknowledged to reset the opportunities for a closer relationship with the EU as a close trading partner. But obviously, I also value our relationship with the US too, and we can look to both directions in a positive way.
We spoke earlier before you joined us with Heather Boushey from the White House Council of Economic Advisors as they beat the drum on accomplishments that have been made over the past couple of years, knowing that it's going to be a lot more difficult in a divided Congress. And one of those achievements is the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know has not always made friends across the ocean. And I just wonder what the UK government's answer is to the IRA.
Well, that's clearly something that we've got to work on. We in the UK have been in a different place with respect to climate change and the move towards renewables. We had a budget a couple of weeks ago where we reaffirmed our commitment to clean energy. There'll be more on that on Thursday of this week. The Prime Minister will be making further announcements. We've also been very clear that we need to continue to invest in renewable energy. We've also made a 20 billion commitment on carbon capture and storage. We're very clear about how we see nuclear as part of the mix. But we're very aware of what's happened in the US, and we'll need to continue to have that deep dialogue that we value so much with our friends in the US over how the implications will work through for the UK and our supply chains.
You're in a bit of a USA tour. New York,
I am.
D.C., you're going
Yes.
to San Francisco.
Yes.
And San Francisco is all about this idea of unicorn kingdom.
Yes.
You want U.S. capital to go to the United Kingdom. But why would U.S. companies invest, say, in London and not Texas?
Well, I hope they can do both. But what I'm saying is that the UK has enormous potential. We have a thriving tech sector, which is the biggest outside of the US and China. And we recognise that there are great opportunities to invest in life sciences, in all the different tech agendas that are so important to the new economy. We've made big calls in terms of our investment in AI and in quantum. And yes, I am promoting UK for investment from US investors, and we value the conversations that we have both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And it's my job to promote the UK, as you would appreciate.
Has it expanded beyond Silicon Roundabout in London?
Well, that's very good that you know about that. But yes, it is. And the Chancellor, my boss, has been, with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is determined that we continue to grow that sector in the UK.
All right, our thanks to John Glen, UK Treasury Chief Secretary. He's the Deputy Chancellor of the Exchequer. To be honest, I know the Silicon Roundabout because that's where all the techies hang out, and it's very close to the Bloomberg office.
Well, it may be expanding. This is somehow appropriate, it feels to me, though, because we're the unicorn of political shows on television.
Yeah, that is true. We try to get a little bit.
Why you're here?
Yeah, we try to get a little bit deeper, not just the surface level.
Exactly.
But I think one key thing we heard is that they are trying to have these discussions still with the United States about the IRA. Exactly. This has really irked European capitals.
For a lot of reasons, and it sounds like they're cooking up their own answer, and dialogue will continue.
Certainly. Dialogue continuing, and coming up next on this program, Mike Pence ordered to testify before a grand jury in one of the cases surrounding former President Trump. That's coming up next for a political panel right here on Balance of Power.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon will be interviewed under oath over his bank's decision to retain the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein as a client. That's according to reporting from the Financial Times. The sworn deposition will take place behind closed doors in May and is the latest development in two high-profile cases brought against the bank by an alleged Epstein victim in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The lawsuits claim that JP Morgan benefited from human trafficking and ignored several internal warnings about their clients' illegal behavior. In France, unions are urging President Emmanuel Macron to hit the brakes on his unpopular pension reform as they held a 10th day of nationwide protests. Unions insist opposition remains strong even as turnout dropped and a garbage strike that has plagued the streets of Paris ended. The strikes are an effort to force Macron to reverse his plan to raise the minimum retirement age to 64 from 62. Officials in the UK have increased the terror threat level in Northern Ireland from substantial to severe. That means they believe an attack is deemed to be, quote, highly likely. The decision came as the 25th anniversary nears of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended decades of unrest in Northern Ireland. President Biden has said he intends to travel to the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to mark the occasion. And consulting giant McKinsey is beginning a rare round of major job cuts. The firm plans to eliminate about 1,400 positions. That will amount to about 3% of headcount. McKinsey has grown from 28,000 staff just 5 years ago to almost 47,000. Most of those affected roles don't have direct contact with clients. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Former President Donald Trump makes a return to the public eye as legal perils loom. Joining us now to discuss our political panel, former Florida Representative Stephanie Murphy and Doug Heye, Senior Vice President of Kraft Digital and former RNC Communications Director. Both of you, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Congresswoman, I want to start with you. You were on the January 6th Select Committee, and today we have news that Trump's former Vice President, Mike Pence, is getting a subpoena. Now, this is to look into a federal investigation, a grand jury into the former president overturning the 2020 election results. What's your reaction to this?
Well, while I support the speech and debate protections that are available for members of Congress, and I understand why there are some situations in which you wouldn't want a former vice president or a former member of Congress or the Senate to testify, I think that our legal system has carve-outs for when there might have been something that was done illegally. And so I'm glad that he's going to have an opportunity to share his side of the story. And my understanding that there are some guardrails that will help protect this from being misused in the future. But I know that Vice President Pence has some very interesting conversations and things that he can share with the investigators. And I think that's important for him to be able to do so.
Doug, as we spend time with a former member of the January 6th committee here, it's not lost on us what happened in Waco, Texas on Saturday night. And I wonder what was going through your mind when you saw Donald Trump actually display video from the riot, from the attack on the Capitol, violent video, along with this anthem that was performed by the so-called January 6th choir, actually celebrating, not denying what happened that day, not calling it a tourist attraction or whatever they say, but actually celebrating the violence.
Well, the sad thing for me is that it's not a surprise. Donald Trump's rhetoric started in a bad place. He started talking about, knock the hell out of him, beat the crap out of him, things like that at rallies, to celebrating this, which is a very dark day in our nation's history. And I think this highlights two things. One, what Trump's rhetoric is going to be in the Republican primaries. There's a part of the party that really wants to hear that. What we saw at Waco. Waco wasn't picked coincidentally, obviously. But also, this shows also what a high bar that Trump is going to have to win those voters who voted for him in 2016, but maybe didn't vote for him or reluctantly voted for him in 2020. This turns off independent voters massively. And so if you're just looking at the brass tacks of this, the questionable and troubling aspects of his side, this is not smart politics if you want to win in November of 2024.
So what would be your advice to the current RNC communications director if you're trying to expand beyond that really only 20-30% he has a true hold on?
Well, the RNC has a very unique role. They don't get involved in primaries at all. And they have very strict rules on this to the point that they can't support Kevin McCarthy for re-election in his primary in his district unless the California Republican Party certifies him in what's called a Rule 11 letter that he's the candidate. So there's not a lot that they can do there.
This individual is talking about, quote, death and destruction.
Sure.
What would they say to that?
You have the brass tacks of where they are, where they want to move past Trump, they want to move past this rhetoric, but they're also beholden to him. The Republican National Committee and Republicans writ large, essentially like Cleavon Little in Blazing Saddles, put a gun to their own head and said, if anybody moves, we'll kill the hostage. And they're very mindful of that. Donald Trump can tank fundraising for not just any Republican, but the RNC. They are caught between a very self-created rock and a hard place.
Stephanie, how worried are you about what appears to be an effort here by Donald Trump and his supporters to normalize, not apologize for, but normalize what happened on January 6th.
Well, just to the previous comment from Doug, what I think is underestimated, or maybe not as discussed, is the same. So the former president understood where he bumped into people who weren't quite loyal enough in the state and federal infrastructure. And he has worked very hard over the last few years to put people in those positions that will be loyal when he calls upon them this time. That's going to be in play for the primary as it will be for the general. And so I think some of those folks will be in place who are willing to maybe fudge the rules, bend the rules, do as the former president asked of them. And then I think the second thing that is interesting is that, the former president has heralded a new era for politicians where if you just don't have any shame for anything that comes at you, it sort of slides off. And you're seeing some members of Congress, newly elected, who have scandal, who just let it slide off of them, come back combative, are emulating the approach that the former president had to a lot of the scandal that he has seen. And so I think, it would be wrong for Democrats to think that Trump isn't a part of this upcoming election.
Coming up, Stephanie and Doug will stay with us to discuss what is on the agenda for Congress. Is there anything on the agenda for Congress? That's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for being with us. Bank regulators testify this week to Congress on the failure of U.S. banking and turmoil in the financial system. SVB in the crosshairs again today. And Stephanie Murphy and Doug Heye are back with us to talk about this. Coming off the hearing today, Doug, it was quite an exercise. We were asking earlier if it was a productive one. We're going to have another tomorrow in the House. You're obviously a former creature of the House of Representatives. How much more rambunctious or less productive might tomorrow's session be?
I think it's probably going to be very similar to what we saw today. And, on all these issues, they're very different issues, even if we think they're somewhat similar. When we talk about banks, people lump them in together. Yep. Credit Suisse and what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, very different set of circumstances. But for the public, they confuse them all and see them all sort of through one lens. Mm-hmm. It's a challenge for Congress to try and get something productive done. And then we have that sort of Damocles hanging over us that's called the debt ceiling. Yep. Patrick McHenry was with our friends at Punch Bowl this morning, says he just doesn't see a solution to this yet. And Patrick McHenry is somebody who is actively looking for solutions on sort of every issue that he works on at financial services. That should send a real warning sign, not just to markets, but to folks on Capitol Hill.
Congresswoman, what do you make of the hearings in terms of they are an autopsy in a sense, but will any regulation come out of it, even something like expanding the FDIC insurance cap, where you do hear from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle that potentially that is something they can work on, but it doesn't seem like there's any momentum for any bipartisanship right now.
As a former member, let me just be very honest that committee hearings are performative theater. They are meant for people to slide into their seat, a few minutes before it's their time to go, give their little 5-minute thing, try to get a viral moment so they can fundraise off of it, and then move on. It's not actually to discover the information that is intended to come from these committees. So my hope is that given as serious as this crisis is that we have some legislators who are willing to dig into exactly how the financial system works and how the different banks operate and put forward legislation that makes sense as opposed to playing to an audience, because that's what we need in this moment is serious legislation to address serious challenges.
Okay, so from the performative standpoint then, Doug, you start looking at the calendar further on down the year. Congress is about to leave for what, until the middle of April. We're going to get to the point of the year being halfway over with what getting done?
Not a lot at this point. And that's part of the problem of not just partisan politics, but we have divided government. And so it's very hard to get, if you can get something through the House, the Senate's going to be a different equation. And we have a Senate that is, in theory at 51-49, or in reality 51-49, but every day operating who's in, who's out in the United States Senate because of illness or other things. Mitch McConnell, John Fetterman, Dianne Feinstein. Very difficult to get anything through the Senate at this point.
So check back next year.
I have to say, I loved that comment from the Congresswoman.
Well, someone who's been there and knows.
She was honest. We thank you so much for
true.
your honesty. Florida Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, former, now
Thanks,
giving us the real deal, and Doug Heye, Senior Vice President of Kraft Digital. More of these stories on the Balance of Power newsletter.
That's right. You can find that on the terminal and online. And many thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'll be back tomorrow.
Yeah.
See you then on Bloomberg TV.